Um, there we go. Recording in progress. It is working. Thanks again. I'll see you at the end. All right, let's get started. Once you click start, attendees can join this webinar. This always feels like a new thing every time I do this, but
Mhm.
not tech savvy. You want to see me trying to do the Eventbrite navigation. That was fun for sure as well.
You did great.
It was hilarious just trying to get everything out. Good evening, everyone. I can see you all starting to filter in from the waiting room. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to my house and my home desk, and also welcome. I'll jump straight to welcome firstly to Professor Beth Breeze. Keep going to say OAM, but OBE. Not quite a dame yet, but will be a dame at some stage. I have no doubt as well. And Rhodri Davies, who I'm sure would make a brilliant dame in a pantomime,
Would
but
make a
also,
wonderful game, yeah, absolutely.
that's something to see as well. But
Life goals.
thank you both for joining me as well too. We'll get on to you in 1 second. I just want to do a very quick framing for us as people start to jump in from the waiting room as well. So welcome to this In Conversation With series. This is something that I started a couple of months ago that we've had a few guests on, and so far with the wonderful Lisa Sargent and Lisa Crawl. Why the hell am I doing this? It's simply born out of my love of giving back and actually geeking out a lot around different things and keep researching and keep reading. And I thought, well, why not share this with other people? Because people have asked before, what are you reading or where are you getting ideas from around things? There's not an original idea in this head. It's all learnings from meeting wonderful people and reading wonderful people, like the two guests that are coming into this episode as well. So you might be someone who's, a researcher, a student, involved in philanthropy, involved in fundraising, works for a nonprofit. You could be an aspiring philanthropist or an active philanthropist yourself as well too, or you're just here to hear about some new ways of thinking. But this is a completely independent space. It's not affiliated to any organization. Pips is in the background having a snooze. She's already bored. I'm not sure where Hamish the cat is or Pippin. Pip, you're in work, Beth, so Pippin's probably at home relaxing in the beanbag, similar to Pips. But it's really about sort of thinking critically and bringing some of the theories and the concepts that we read about to life as well too. So I couldn't think of a better. Oh, hang on, sorry. I couldn't think of better people to do that with. But I do need to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting this evening as well too. I'm obviously here in Brisbane, Meanjin, which is the lands of the Turrbal and Ugara people. These the sovereignty has never been ceded here and always will be Aboriginal lands as well. And I do recognise any of our emerging leaders or any Aboriginal individuals joining us on this evening's call as well. Kia ora to Atoria, New Zealand as well. We have a few New Zealand guests joining us this evening. You're very welcome. Everyone's very welcome in the house and at the desk as well. I'm going to throw to Beth and Rhodri, say a quick hello, and then I'll get us into what we're going to talk about this evening or this morning for you. School runs done,
Yes.
etc.
Yeah.
Hi,
Beth,
everybody. It's lovely to be here. David, thank you so much for inviting us and for organising us. I know there's an incredible array of people on the call today, and I'm really looking forward to interacting with you all and hope that this is a useful hour for everybody.
Yeah,
thanks, Beth.
likewise. Lovely to be here. Good morning, good evening to everybody. Hopefully that balances out quite well. I always find when you have enough of a time difference that it works quite well. It's only when you've got a small time difference that gets kind of a little bit tricky sometimes. So yeah, really looking forward to it.
Sounds good. Thank you. So, extraordinary thinkers that you both are. Your current book that's out at the moment, Rich Expectations: Why Rich People Give, is already reshaping. Like, I wanted to read it that quickly that you're showing off your hard copy. I've got the PDF that I bought and
Yeah.
downloaded, so I need to get a hard copy ordered so that it makes its way over here at some stage as well, rather than just my terrible notes that are clipped to things. But it's really been sort of reshaping already how we think about philanthropy and wealth. And of course, Beth, you've written your book on In Defense of Philanthropy. I do have a copy of that. You see, actual hard copy, as well as many other literature that you've been involved with as a researcher at Kent and Canterbury University, and of course, Rhodri as well. You've written The Public Good by Private Means, and then of course this little pretext to that doorstop that was an introduction to philanthropy as well too. So all of the things that we will be talking about and referencing in tonight's episode will be contained in the email follow up as well. But It's really sort of helped us get into a space of where we can talk about the legitimacy of philanthropy and how it sort of is evolving globally, and how fundraisers or advisors and policymakers can navigate the expectations. But I got to ask, why expectations? What made this the right frame for examining wealth and wealthy giving at this point in time?
Sure, I'm happy to take that one, David. And as ever, there's a story that lies behind it. So, for those who don't know, this book is the third in the series of our attempt to understand why rich people give in the UK, but we do think the findings are applicable elsewhere, although look forward to you telling us how they might be shaped by your local context. So, back in the early 2000s, Theresa Lloyd did the first series, book in the series, and that's just called Why Rich People Give. And she did in-depth interviews and surveys with a number of people, and it was the first time really there was any data on wealthy giving in the UK. 10 years after that, she asked me to work with her to update it, and we revisited about half of her original sample and then added another half, which has become the model that we've used for this third edition.
Right.
The second book was called Richer Lives because the key finding there was that being philanthropic enriches your life. It makes life more interesting. You get relationships, you get experiences you wouldn't have had if you hadn't been a donor. You feel your life has been well lived and so on. So that was the main framing 10 years ago. What we found this time when we analysed the data, and it's based on 88 interactions with wealthy donors, including in-depth interview surveys, and again, half and half old and new donors. The reason we picked expectations as the framing is because that was such a strong theme that came through. And by the way, David, not just the expectations that we have of donors, but that everybody has of everybody else and of themselves. So fundraisers have expectations of donors, that they will respect their expertise, that they will be a good supporter and partner of the cause, providing ideally unrestricted longer term funding. Donors have expectations of themselves. They've been lucky, they've been successful, they've maybe inherited wealth, they've lived in a context that's allowed them to create wealth. So they feel that they ought to give something back to society. By the way, they also expect it of their peers. And some of the interesting findings were how they felt about their peers who had similar success or luck and didn't give back. There's expectations from policymakers and politicians, from the public, from the media. So it just kept coming up, bubbling up in all the data. And that's why we chose that as the framing this time.
Mm. And Rhodri, what most surprised you from the research? Like, what did donors say that contradicted the public narrative, or was there a contradiction there?
I guess there was. I think it's more difficult for people like Beth and I, and probably you, David, in that not that many things about philanthropy do surprise us because we spend all of our time talking about it and thinking about it. So I think it kind of confirmed a few suspicions and things sort of anecdotally. I guess a couple of them that stood out to me. One was, any sense that donors are out there somehow oblivious to the fact that there's critiques of philanthropy it just doesn't seem to play out. I mean, most of them, I think, are keenly aware of it, not just because, there's been a growing atmosphere of criticism over the last decade or so, but I think there's something kind of inherent to philanthropy that if you do it at any sort of level, you inevitably come up against some of these ethical conundrums and fairly sort of deep questions about what it is and how you do it and the responsibilities it brings. And donors, are just as aware of that as the people kind of sort of criticizing them from the other side often. I think added to that, one of the things that really struck me, it wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was a really good reminder for me, was we spoke to quite a lot of donors, particularly next generation donors, for whom engaging with that criticism wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't something they kind of discovered later on. It was kind of baked into their approach from the outset. So they were getting into philanthropy with these sort of challenging questions in mind and trying to sort of frame their philanthropy in light of that. But the thing that really came out was that all of them said some form of, well, sooner or later, you've just got to do something. So there was this sense of, yes, engage with the critique and take it on board. And there's often, more than a kernel of truth in some of it. And it's important to acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, don't let that stop you just doing something. One donor said, do the next best thing, take your next best step, and then take your next best step, and kind of each time try and learn and get better, but don't sort of get paralyzed by the fear of not doing something perfect. And that's something I think that's really stuck with me out of the interviews.
The motivations, I mean, what came through as a key finding in reading it was that motivations were layered. It was duty, it was enjoyment, it was legacy, it was identity. And much of the public debate around giving can sometimes assume calculation like status, tax, naming rights. But what Rich Expectations has done, and also then other donor psychology research has really quantified, especially when Jen Shang and Adrian Sargent looked at their book around meaningful philanthropy, was always that about that it was deeply tied to who we are. It was about our identity. It was about belonging. It was about self-expression. So how far do you agree that philanthropy is at its core an act of self-construction? And where does that collide with the moral language of duty and obligation? And did that come up in your research? And not just in this, but in the years and of
Yeah.
course your depth of knowledge that you have?
Thanks, David. That's a great question. And I think that throughout, I've been studying philanthropy for about 20 years. And before that, for those who don't know, I was working in philanthropy, mostly as a fundraiser, but also as a non-profit manager. And I've also studied and worked with a lot of philanthropy advisors and grant makers. So seen it from a lot of different angles. And I think that throughout all of that time, it's very clear that philanthropy has got both private benefits and a private role and public benefits and a public role. And I think a lot of the misunderstandings of philanthropy come about when people don't realize that those two coexist, fairly well, and inevitably, every gift given brings some benefit to the donor, whether that's just a feeling that you're living your life well, that you're enjoying that experience, as I mentioned earlier. Perhaps if you're a religious person, you might believe you ought to do that for your religious kind of
Mm,
faith instructions, or perhaps your humanistic view that this is the values you want to lead. So it was ever thus that when you give a donation, there's a public benefit and a private benefit. They coexist fairly happily until
mm,
you have come across somebody who says there must be no private benefit at all. And this is when
mm,
you get into, what is altruism? Should there be an entirely altruistic, entirely selfless gift? And most of the thinkers that I agree with would say it's not possible. There is no such thing as the entirely disinterested gift. What we need to do is
mm,
make sure that the balance is correct, both legally, morally, and so on. And because the actual tangible benefits that are allowed are regulated by law, and they're usually fairly minor. But the
mm.
intangible benefits, the feeling like you're a good person, the feeling that you're role modeling to your children how to live a good life, the feeling that you've left a legacy so that when you're gone, people think of you well.
Yeah.
These are the kind of benefits people get. And going back to the point about expectations, I think these are the kind of unstated expectations that lead to misunderstanding. So why do you want your name on a building? I mean, I'm now working at the University of Oxford at Harris Manchester College, and the central building in the college is called the Arlosh Building. It's named after for a family who only had one son. It's quite an unusual surname, and the name was going to die out because he died, unfortunately, young. So they gave the
Mm,
money, and we now talk every day about going to the Arlosh for lunch or see you in the Arlosh Tower. So they've succeeded in what they wanted, which are our colleagues who study legacies, charitable legacies, would talk about symbolic immortality. But you don't have to call
mm,
it that. You can just call it keeping a name alive because it means something to you as a family. So I
mm,
think that these are things that if we just spoke about more openly and gave examples, as I've given then, it would help people to understand there's not something dodgy or dubious going on when
mm,
people get some kind of private benefit, but it's all part of the piece of what makes philanthropy work.
mm. Rhodri, okay, Beth's a previous fundraiser. You're not, you're a mathematician and everything else that's come through, as well as a philanthropic buff and around
Yeah.
things. But obviously, based on your research and your osmosis of being around Beth, how can fundraisers translate, or how can fundraisers of all levels translate that insight into practice, where they're designing approaches around meaning and not just motivation? Have
I
you?
think that's the key. And most fundraisers that I've met and successful fundraisers, I mean, firstly, I've got untapped quantities of respect for the fundraisers I meet, mainly because it's one job I absolutely couldn't do. I'd be terrible at it. And actually, I've proven myself quite bad at it over the years. But I think to be a good fundraiser, you've got to be everything from a sort of amateur psychologist through to an economist to to whatever. You've got to understand all of these different motivations and the things that actually drive giving, both because that's sort of pragmatic. You're actually trying to kind of get people to engage and not just open up their wallets, but to genuinely sort of engage with your issue and kind of build a relationship of long-term support. But also because I think that just gives you a richer appreciation of what philanthropy means to everyone that's involved in it. And I do think, going back to what Beth was saying there about some of the kind of trying to understand that what's sometimes painted as an element of self-interest in philanthropy. I think it's easy often for that to get caricatured as the self-interest is a desire for status or reputation laundering or to reduce your tax bill. And yes, we all know there are on occasion elements of that in some examples of philanthropy, but there's so many other aspects of the personal benefit that come from philanthropy that are more, and this is what we heard about in our interviews, which in many cases were extremely kind of personal in nature. People talking about having entirely lacked a sense of purpose in life and then having found one, and then having some sort of epiphany of self-realization where they were able to kind of understand who they were and who they wanted to be, and philanthropy allowing them to do that. And the enjoyment, and again, not just in the, oh, it's nice because I get to go to the opera house and get treated nicely, but because they genuinely got to interact with people who were quite differently motivated to them and had kind of dedicated their lives to doing something for the public good, or were doing really interesting academic work or kind of creative endeavors, and the benefit that these wealthy people said that they found with a pretty healthy dose of humility in a lot of cases from that, I think was, it was really interesting to hear. And again, entirely understandable. I think that's one of the things that I was reminded about talking to lots of wealthy people, is a lot of the things that they talk about that they get out of giving and what sort of gets them doing it and keeps them doing it are the same things that, if you asked me why I give to charity, I would say. So it's kind of, if they're not legitimate in their case at a slightly bigger scale, why are they okay for me to say, actually, it gives me a sense of self-worth and value to give to charity? So I do think, sometimes it's just a matter of degree, and we need to be more tolerant or even kind of charitable towards understanding other people's motivations.
I think, as we talked about just before, Rhodri, there's a study every day that's coming out, like literally at the minute. It seems to be there's just every week there's something else that happens. And in the lead up to this conversation, it was hard to keep up at some stages where they just seem to be coming out. A lot of banks publishing studies as well, and around their sort of wealth advisors. We're going to come on to that in a second around the intermediary bit, but the Bank of America study that sort of talked about affluent donors. They talked about the fact that they found that those that actively measured the impact were much more confident about their giving. And I guess in some ways, I'm curious around how charities can bridge that confidence gap without making it feel like giving is transactional. But then equally, I'm curious then about this intergeneration aspect as well too, because that came across both in your research and then some local research that's been happening here in Australia by Coda Capital, Matters That Matter, that talked about the family and legacy drive, how that drives engagement into giving, and many much more around. I think it was I'm getting my banks muddled up now. Was it Barclays Bank then, with their report that they talked about the wealthy donors, the modern philanthropists?
Modern philanthropist,
they talked about, that one, that they talked about younger self-made want the data and the authenticity. So in that whole sort of mixture, do you have any commentary around that? Like, how does that align with what you found in your own research?
I mean, if I could just jump in and just build
Before
we get to that, just build on the point that Roger made, which I think is a really crucial one, that, most people give. Philanthropy just means love of humankind. It doesn't mean billionaires giving money. It just means all of us doing things that we don't have to do. So it's not paying tax, it's not buying stuff in the market. It's a whole other area of life. And I think it's a really crucial point that we risk exoticizing wealthy people. Perhaps we're, partly guilty for writing books called Why Rich People Give, because as Roger just said, the answer is they give for pretty much the same reasons as the rest of us. So apologies for the clickbait title, but it does help sell books. But I think there's a really profound truth there that, if we're allowed to walk around wearing, wristbands or pins or, buttons that say I've donated, that's on the same spectrum as other people being proud of having supported a cause. And I think also it links to what makes fundraising work. And you asked Roger about that. And I think, there's fundraisers on the call here, we will all know, and I still consider myself a fundraiser, even though I've been studying it for longer than I've been doing it, because most of my students are fundraisers. If all donations are given anonymously, that does not help fundraising. You have to respect a donor if they want to give anonymously, and there can be good reasons for that because of the cause or because of the context. But actually, having somebody's name on a building or in a program, or them being willing to speak about their giving, helps to establish generosity as a norm. And then people think, oh, okay, okay, if you've got spare cash, this is what people do. And
Mm,
one of the reasons that I think there's so much more philanthropy in the US, and it's a complicated issue, but one of them is because it's talked about publicly. There's
mm,
names everywhere, there's coverage, it's just known that when you're wealthy, one of the things you do with your money is give it away. And I don't think that's always the case in Australia and in the UK and certainly in mainland Europe. So, having names on things, and this goes back to the expectations, the assumptions, is not
mm,
necessarily about somebody being wildly egotistical and
Yeah.
demanding their name be put up in lights and 10 foot high. It is often part of the fundraiser strategy to say, look, you're a well-known donor. You've given us a large sum of money. You've obviously done your due diligence and think this project or this charity is worth it. If you help us by, declaring your sort of affiliation with it, that will help us reach other donors who don't have the time to do the due diligence or who respect you or who know you
Yeah.
personally and so on. So I think it's really important to understand both the asking and the giving side of these things. And going back to the point Roger said earlier about how 89%, I don't know if you gave the figure, but nearly all 89% of our interviewees said that they were aware of criticisms of philanthropy. And then
mm,
we said, well, so what impact does that have on your giving? And then 22% of them said it makes me less likely to talk about my giving, to go
mm,
public, to do profiles, to give speeches, to be a kind of a known philanthropist, because you're just inviting criticism. So I just
mm,
wanted to put those 2 points together to say there is a consequence of critiquing. Of course, we should feel free to question how philanthropy is done
mm.
and to make sure it's done better. But the kind of mindless, generalized, cynical criticism may in fact end up hurting the charity sector if people are not willing to talk about their giving and therefore encourage others. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
add that
No, no,
point.
no, you're
So
very,
on
very
your
true. One of the hardest things to do is to convince someone to talk about it. I mean, even just in terms of awards, like here in Queensland, we have philanthropy awards and a philanthropy week. Queensland being the state here in Australia. For others, it might be joining from the UK. But in doing so, it's one of those things that you want the recognition. The recognition conversation that goes with them. It's very difficult sometimes because they don't want to talk about it. But then it's almost another ask to them to try and say, but
Yeah.
if you do this, others will actually see that this is the norm. This is something that's good for society. It's something that's good for people who want to engage in this publicly. It's not about saying, yay, you, as much as they perceive that it is, but you're trying to put it into the context of, but if I nominate you for an award, it's purely broadcasting to, Queensland and indeed the country. Giving is good, and you're going to get a lot of enjoyment out of this as well. But like you say, we're going to come on to some of the critiques that come out of that as well. And you stole the stack
no,
because I was
thanks for
about to
that.
say it.
Mm,
Rich
No,
expectations.
thanks for
You
that,
talked
David.
about it. So I mean, you talked about this in the book before. This as well too, Beth. In defense of philanthropy as well. That that talks about the holding nuance that's there. It can be flawed, but still fundamentally good. And there's a lot of if anything, it sort of stretches out about ethics or abstract. They show up in every gift conversation that we're having, and any part of that engagement with our donors as well.
Yeah. And it
You've
links to
already
your
sort of
question, David, because you're asking us about intergenerational giving. So I
yeah,
can make a link to that, which is there's some lovely research which shows that if that being parented and also being a parent, in
yeah,
fact, our research supports this, but it's both directions. It's how you were parented and the fact of having children. Both of these affect your inclination to be philanthropic and how you conduct that. And the way one influences one's children is by what one does, not what one says. And I say that as somebody who's just tried to pack off a 14-year-old school this morning. I had to sort of model getting your breakfast, getting out of the house. And it's no good just if you just shout and say, people don't, your children don't listen to you. So being public about your giving is essential if you want to be a parent whose children know that philanthropy is a good thing. You have to talk about it. So there's some lovely research showing that if you simply, and this is useful for all of us, if you simply sign up to charities by direct debits or quietly give them money, and your children don't know you give, they are no more likely to be philanthropic than somebody else's kid whose parents don't give at all. You
yeah,
can't do it silently. You have to talk about it, even if it's a bit cringeful. So
mm,
that same logic of setting norms and being proud of giving and saying, here's why I do it, here's why this cause matters to me, here's why I set aside some of my income to support, other things that are important, matters
mm,
within the family unit as well as within society. So I think the intergenerational piece is really important, and it came through loud and clear in
mm,
this book. I think there's probably more on parenting in this third edition than there is in the first two editions, because people are more and more aware of the need to think clearly about how they avoid harming their children with too large inheritances. I mean, it's a problem that only a few people have, but some people do have the problem that you can set your children up for life. You can pay their education, you can buy their first house, you can do all the things you need to do. You can then provide for all your own future security, and you still have some spare. What are you going to do with it? And I think it's increasingly understood that it's not healthy for society or for the family just to keep that money and hand it down through the generations. That's the inequality that causes the biggest harm when people have those lump sums behind them. So philanthropy is a wonderful solution to that, either setting up a foundation that the family can give away together, or moving it all off in one fell swoop. So I think the family is an incredibly important part of this whole conversation. And Roger, I don't know if you had any thoughts on people you spoke to.
Well, I was just going to come in on, I mean, sort of cycle back to answer the question before about impact, just to pick on that, because I think it's a really, really interesting point. And I think in terms of the Bank of America study, I think it was on donors who measure impact feeling more confident. To some extent, that seems intuitively obvious. I mean, if you've got a sense that your money is having an effect or an impact, clearly you're going to feel better about it. I think the bit, and similarly linking that to the point before, I think in terms of the intergenerational bit, we certainly spoke to some donors who were kind of next generation and also to multiple generations of the same family. And it did, not quantitatively, but certainly qualitatively and anecdotally back up what has been said in many other places, that next generation of donors do have a particular focus on the idea that they want their giving to have an impact. I think the danger is that sometimes that people then immediately move to, well, that means that they want, impact reporting, and they want a spreadsheet, and they want, qualies and all this sort of stuff. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think impact is in danger of becoming a word that has as many connotations as philanthropy does, in a sort of similarly helpful way. Because I'm working on a project at the moment that's basically about going around the UK and talking to charities that have had the support of philanthropy to just basically tell a story about what difference that has allowed them to make, not particularly in a sort of quantitative way, but just in a narrative way. And it's kind of occurred to me that actually these are just impact stories, but just getting that impact across in a different way, and actually probably a way that is the one that cuts through to most people. Because I think giving is always some combination of head and heart, and for some donors it's very heavily towards the head sense, and if you're kind of fully aligned with effective altruism, you might be kind of absolutely at that end of the spectrum. And some people are entirely the heart end, and they just kind of wait and see what it is that kind of tugs at their emotions and then give to that. Most people, I would think, are somewhere in the middle of that, where they absolutely heart plays a part, because then they can't just decide for themselves to care about a particular cause or issue out of nowhere. It'll be because of the personal experience or connection or something that one of their friends or peers or family members has brought to their attention. But then when they do give to it, they want to know that their money isn't just kind of disappearing into a void. So they want some sense of how it's having an impact. And that might be some kind of overview of the finances and the kind of measures of impact, but it's also just likely to be stories about how has this actually affected somebody's life, or how has it affected a community or made a difference to a cause area. So I think impact is important, but it's also important that we're clear what we mean by impact.
Yeah, I think that you're entirely right. I mean, it's that buzzword that was there many, many years ago when we sat in, I think it was it was a Demos think tank, I think, at that stage that was there, that we were looking at SROI readiness across various charities in the UK, and assessing that, and kind of thinking key performance and social indicators of things, and thinking, oh God, we're going down a wormhole here of just data metrics around things. And it was interesting hearing our former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who of course is chair of Wellcome Trust, when she was speaking in Hong Kong last year, she talked about distinguishing between random acts of kindness and systematic approaches that require metrics and measurement, but not going too nuts, as she reverberated in a summit here in Australia recently about the metrics mania that can take over things, which sort of follows through with some of what you're sort of describing there as well. I think
just on that, David, some of the most, some of you know, I did the £1 Million Donor Report for about 10 years, and one of the things that came through was a feeling that if I'm giving at that level, if I'm already giving £7 figures, I already know and trust you. Yes, I want to know you're collecting the data because you should be doing that anyway for running your own charity. But if you present me with a clearly expensively compiled, long, dull list of figures and facts and figures, it changes the nature of the relationship. I thought I was on the inside. I'm on your board. I'm around the charity a lot. Why are you treating me like somebody who's never encountered the cause before and giving me all these kind of facts and figures that I haven't asked for? Now, some have asked for it. And again, going back
Yeah.
to the question, what do fundraisers do? You've got to work out which ones would like a photo and a short story and which ones really do want a whole load of figures.
Mm.
That's part of the skill of being a fundraiser.
Mm.
But fundamentally, I think that if you're already giving at that level, the level of the trust is there, and one shouldn't treat somebody as if it's the first time they've ever come into contact with that cause and be giving them those really basic facts and figures unless they ask for it.
Yeah.
You can tell them where it is. Here it's available. But I think we risk slightly alienating our larger donors if we provide them with all this information as if they were sort of a customer or a client rather than a
Yeah.
partner. And the best supporters see themselves as a partner. They happen to have the resources, the charity happens to have the skills and the manpower on the ground. Together, you can make good change happen in the world. And I think it's
Mm.
important to live that partnership in reality and not spoil it by going too far down that metrics madness.
Yeah, it's
And
relational at
just
the
on
end of the
the,
day.
I'm just going to say on the point you mentioned there about Julie Gillard, I've just echoed something that we found a lot in the book that again actually really stuck with me, which was the number of donors who talked about, yes, absolutely, have a strategic approach, choose what you want to do, put in place programs, have in place measurement, but don't do that at the expense of the stuff that is more kind of heart driven or reactive, because a lot of them said the thing is giving at the end of the day, it's a habit, or some of them said, a muscle, and you have to keep exercising it or doing it. And actually it's often that stuff you need to just keep giving in a sort of more informal, responsive way, because
Mm.
actually if you go too far towards the abstract, the danger is it just all becomes a bit cold and mechanistic, and it's easy to sort of lose sight of why you started in the first place. So quite a few
Mm.
people we spoke to made that point, which I think is an important one.
I think what was lovely that came across in some of the testimonials was the relationship that they had with the fundraisers or indeed their
Mm.
advisors, but equally just in the charitable or in the charity itself, not through expectation in terms of getting the door in to access the board, but actually having a relationship with someone. Because going back to what you described there before, when philanthropy gives someone a sense of purpose and identity and meaning, all of a sudden they're, the fundraising manager, the philanthropy manager, whoever it is that's there, they're leaning on that conversation. They're leaning on that relationship, an awful lot. And I think that certainly came up in a lot of the testimonials that you sort of phrased throughout the book as well. The ecosystem around giving has expanded an awful lot, and we're seeing that even more here in Australia and indeed in certain parts of Asia, where I've sort of been diving into a bit of international reading, we'll say, geeking out, etc. as well. But with advisors and family offices and DAFs and impact funds and various sort of vehicles or opportunities or forums being created, it's something that has a lot of people pointing out a bit of a risk around it. And the CAF report that's just come out, I think about a week ago at this stage as well too, it sort of touched on it, that empowering client giving means that it's helping donors navigate that sort of purpose with confidence and clarity as well. You've discussed this within the role of intermediaries and advisors in a particular sort of section of the book as well. Can you comment on that and about how we build trust across each of those individuals? Because there's been certain arguments that have talked about it becoming too technical, or is it over professionalized? And to your point, does it become cold then? Or is it pointing towards rising expectations and legitimacy concerns? What's the sort of lens, and how do we navigate that, or what do we sort of? Yeah, I had a question in there and it's left me now, but
No, I heard
it's
the
in and
question.
around that bit of just all of those
It's a good
intersections
one.
in that philanthropy ecosystem. So how do we keep it relational with the technical that it's become in some ways? But would love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's a really good question, David. And I think
Tongue
that,
tied
that one of
question.
the
That.
no, I heard it. I heard it. And you set me up to tell you one of my favorite findings from the book, which, so thank you for giving me the chance to do that. And that's that I mean, you're quite right. Philanthropy is complex, and if it's done well, it needs to be done thoughtfully. And most donors want to do it thoughtfully. As Roger said, they want to have impact. That shouldn't be surprising. You want your money to be spent well. So one of the things that's changed the most over the 3 decades that this study has been occurring is people's willingness to seek professional advice so that they can navigate all this complexity and make better decisions. So back in 2000, when the study first began, there really weren't many places you could go to get help. I mean, if you were very wealthy and had a big foundation, you might have a family office, or you might have some professional staff who were providing that kind of advice and support. But really, no one else had that. They were just asking their friends and family, what do you do? So it's kind of mutual aid. By 2012, when the second book was done, the big banks pretty much all had philanthropy advice services. In the UK, it began in 2005 with Coutts Bank, and the others all followed quite swiftly afterwards. So if you were banking and it was clear you had that kind of money, the ability to make big gifts, then you did have available to you in-house philanthropy support. Since then, the development of boutique or independent philanthropy advisors and people's willingness to use them has been, as I say, one of the biggest changes over the 3 decades. And we found this time 43% had already sought that kind of advice, and another 10% were willing to do so. So that tips you over into a majority that either had or intended to. That's a big change from pretty much nobody, in the first book. And so people, and I think it's part of a general trend. My kids don't do anything without looking for a YouTube video for how to do it. How do I sort of open the curtains? How do I bake a cake? How do I change a plug? So it's quite normal, I think. And philanthropy can take advantage of that. People want to know how to do things, and they expect that information to be readily available. Perhaps we could do more to make some of this available for free. Because people do still have a bit of a reluctance to pay for it, even though clearly some are willing to do so. And I would always have a shout out for the community foundations as a place where you can get that advice, if not for free, then at least built into the service. And it's understood as normal practice that you provide that kind of advice to donors to help them work out what do you care about and how best to give. So I think that's really quite exciting. And then we also asked the question, well, having taken advice, what difference did it make? And 2/3 said, yeah, it had made a difference. I guess the other third might say, no, I was already doing it fine as I was, or, just kind of reassuring that they were doing the right thing. And those who said it had made a difference, there were two main directions. The first is the most obvious one. It made their giving more strategic. If you've got somebody working with you, you probably are going to streamline your causes, have a plan, maybe set up a new vehicle. So more strategic giving was one main outcome. But another which really pleased me was that people said they'd become more thoughtful and empathic givers. So when you get advice, it helps you understand, okay, what's this like from the charity's point of view? What's this like from the policymakers' point of view? How does what you're doing fit into what everybody else is doing? And how can you make the best contribution? And how can you do that in a way that's sensitive and delicate? So you don't walk into a charity and ask for things that are unreasonable. You don't conduct visits that are, impolite or cause stress for the charity you're dealing with. So I think that's a really positive development. And I know that's happening in Australia and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, Rhodri, do you want to build on that?
I was just going to say the other aspect that I've been struck by a bit recently in some of the interactions I've had with people involved in advisory work is that there's this slight, I think there's been a tendency to kind of stereotype the idea of philanthropy advice as if it is kind of, a very lowest common denominator thing, or something that is essentially don't scare the horses, stick to, what's easy and kind of goes along with the status quo. So that advisors are providing advice that kind of curbs any of the potential sharp edges and results in philanthropy becoming very risk averse. And I don't actually think that's true, certainly not these days, because as Beth says, maybe there was a time when all of the philanthropy advice was coming from the big banks, and maybe it kind of, there was an element of truth in that. But now there's such a spectrum of advice, through from relatively sort of small c conservative through to stuff that will really challenge and push donors, that actually I think in many cases where donors have some desire to engage with things that are a bit more difficult or risky, they can go out and seek this kind of advice, and it will help them to go further than they ever would have done on their own, because it can kind of de-risk it a bit through knowledge sharing, or they can kind of pool funds with other people. Or I've seen examples where intermediary advisors and other kind of organizations are able to help philanthropists to fund social movements or grassroots organizers that are relatively radical, and they almost certainly wouldn't have funded directly themselves. So actually advice, I think, is playing quite an important role in sort of pushing the boundaries and kind of nudging philanthropy to be more rather than less radical and risk tolerant. So I think it's really interesting to kind of think about it in those terms as well.
So what do you think? What do you think makes a good intermediary practice? Like, what does that actually look like in 2025 and beyond? Where are advisors most helpful, or where do they risk overstepping? If that, from your point of view.
I mean, I think
So
Beth will have more thoughts on this than me, having written a book on it.
you can see over that shoulder the book
Yeah,
Advising Philanthropists, done with Emma Beeston. So I refer you to no, but and we also have a chapter in in this book called Who Supports the Donors. I think it's, to be honest, one of the findings I'd love to share is that I think fundraisers and advisors have got a lot more in common than people realise.
mm,
Actually, but both of them are playing that intermediate role, which is the word you used. Both of them are
Mhm.
trying to encourage more giving and better giving. So it's both. It's not just more. The numbers alone are not sufficient to have the impact that we were talking about before. Both of
Mm.
them want to help those things happen. Now, the fundraiser, of course, is employed by the charity. The advisor is probably employed by the donor. So they're coming at it from a slightly different angle. But I think the best fundraisers and the best advisors have the good of society in mind, have the broader public benefit
Mm.
in mind. So I have had my own experience, and I'm sure other fundraisers have had, where you've met a donor who's generous, who's interested, but actually there's another cause that's that the thing they want to do right now might be better suited to another organisation that or to another part of your own organisation. So you're trying to work out what's best for them and for society as well as for your own, like your goal to get a specific thing funded. And the same thing with advisors. They're trying to scan the horizon. Where best can this family, this individual, this company make the contribution that they want to make? And there's often movement between these two professions. So a number of fundraisers came to study at the University of Kent on our course, and by the end of it had decided to retrain and become a philanthropy advisor or establish themselves as an
Yeah.
advisor because they'd learned about the profession and they could use the knowledge they'd gained during their career as a fundraiser to offer good advice. I think, though, it's also important to say you have to start with where the person is. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm definitely going to give to the opera, the donkeys, whatever, I just need your advice on which one to give to, then you have to start there. But over time, if they're open and if the advisor listens well and provides that kind of broader context and information, they may well see, well, actually, as well as doing this, I can expand and start looking at maybe access to the opera as well as excellence, or perhaps in my community, by helping animals, I'm also helping people, and you can slowly move towards a more thoughtful and impactful philanthropy, and that's why philanthropy is fundamentally dynamic. Most of the criticisms of philanthropy assume it's just kind of freeze frame, like this particular donation wasn't as good as it could be or didn't make sense, but yet they're not looking at it in the context of the donor's journey, to use a rather
Mm.
cliched phrase. And we all have to
Mm.
start somewhere. So yes,
Mm.
perhaps your early gifts are more straightforward, but if you go on that journey and if people understand you're trying to do good in the world, you just need time to work through the best way to do that, then I think we can see an awful lot of development over the lifetime of any individual or family or company, and we could be celebrating that rather than picking on something they did 20, 30 years ago and say, gosh, wasn't that a silly gift to give? So I think the
Mm.
dynamic nature, and just to share one final thought before I stop talking, is that again, the people we interviewed had a lot of really interesting comments on this about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, getting started. And one said, you can't teach somebody how to improve their golf swing if they've never picked up a club. And then can't start here when people are only here. And another said, there's a reason why when you get onto a moving escalator, there's steps that take you up a floor. There's a reason why the first step is flat. So it's very easy to get on and then you move up. And the same with philanthropy. You need to let people just start where they are. I worry about donkeys, I worry about whatever, and then let them learn through the process. Because philanthropy, there's so much to learn. As you said, it's very complex. We can't expect the first time donor to fully understand all the nuance and the complexity. We need to encourage that generous impulse and then work with them to become the best donor that they can be.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's why it's about expectation and just it's not even alignment. The first conversation that you're having with someone who's new into this as well, they can often say, "I have no idea what I'm doing," and you're there to navigate and kind of go, "Well, what is this? What is the other?" We all do it, when we have that privilege of sitting in front of people to have that initial conversation with them and get into the nitty gritty of their values, their family values. What is it about them that they're interested in? As you said, donkeys or medical research, and certainly in my context, or lately at the moment as well. So So your book calls for a national philanthropy strategy and a government champion. Now, this, of course, is something that's been debated over here in Australia for quite a long time, and it echoes a lot of what's been coming up through the sort of civil society strategy that's in the UK and stuff as well at the minute. Now, I did write for fun. I wrote a comment down because I thought, is it as easy as William Hague said in September, create more wealth and create more philanthropists when he was interviewed in the Times? Or obviously that's a previous prime minister over in the UK, but around the world we're seeing very varying degrees of integration between philanthropy and public policy. But why do you believe a national strategy is essential, and what would it look like in practice?
Shall I go on this one?
Go for that one,
I mean,
Rhodri.
I guess, yeah, in terms of the book itself and what we decided to do this time, I think in previous editions there had been a series of recommendations that kind of stemmed directly from the findings in the book, and they were aimed at a whole mixture of fundraisers, donors themselves, people in the media, and kind of things that could be done to build a stronger culture of giving in the UK. I think because in a way the external environment has moved on, certainly in the last decade or so. And I obviously used to work at the Charities Aid Foundation and was more kind of directly involved in efforts around public policy and philanthropy in the UK. But a lot of these calls that were made back in the last edition in 2012 are kind of were already ones that other people were echoing, and they've been built on since then. And a sort of groundswell has built and a bit of a coalition in the UK pushing for a number of things, and particularly as you identify, one of them was just for the government to have a kind of a strategy on philanthropy, and then beyond that, perhaps to kind of appoint an individual or a kind of department that was a focal point for philanthropy. And so we thought in the book, rather than reinventing the wheel at this point in time, why don't we just lend our weight to what's already out there, acknowledge that. So we chose to kind of include and got Kath Dovey, who used to be a Beacon Fellowships, now MPC, and some people from CAF to help us with kind of putting in a version of the work that they'd pulled together calling for a national philanthropy strategy, and just to lend our support to that. I guess in terms of where that's going, actually, even since the book, I guess we can claim a win, because the government has recently announced the formation of an office for the impact economy. As a whole other question that we could get into about that terminology, or that would be for a different call. But I think it's really positive. There's definitely signs of movement. I think still, as ever, a lot of work to be done to close the gap between positive rhetoric and the reality of what it means on the ground. But I think there is more of an opportunity to push on government support for philanthropy than there has been at any time that I can remember. And I think that comes, as you say, David, at a point in time where there's lots of other really interesting stuff going on elsewhere around the world. I know in Australia, they had the Productivity Commission review and lots of interesting recommendations. And that's some of them Australia specific, and other ones that definitely kind of echoed elsewhere. Ireland's pretty well developed in terms of having its own national philanthropy strategy. The island of Jersey has just announced that it's doing its own philanthropy strategy. So I think there's suddenly this kind of sense that this is a thing that governments can and perhaps should think about doing. And I think that's really good. And I'll just leave you with the thought that one of the things that always concerns me is that when government does sort of think about philanthropy, which is fairly rare in all honesty, I think we should all kind of admit that it's not something that tends to be front of mind for them. The danger is that it's a very instrumental view. It tends to be, we don't have as much money as we would like. Hang on a minute, there's a source of money over there. Can we get some of that money to spend on the things that we don't have money for? And that, I think, is, well, first of all, it kind of underplays the potential value of philanthropy, and sort of doesn't give heed to that wider value of what it would mean to kind of build a culture of giving in the UK or elsewhere. And also it's potentially counterproductive, because the more that you do that, the danger is that you piss philanthropists off and they go, actually, that's not how I want you to sort of see my giving. And that if government comes in and just sort of says, can you align what you're doing with what government wanted to do anyway, you might well end up kind of killing the goose that laid the golden egg slightly. So I think, governments having a broader view of, let's develop a fully blown and rounded strategy for engaging with philanthropy is a really healthy thing.
Yeah. Can I just say, I mean, agree with everything that Roger's just said, and to acknowledge Australia's role actually in making all these things happen. I mean, we had a visit from Christian Siebold over to Europe in September, which was incredibly helpful. He visited the Irish philanthropy community, and to share how things are developed in Australia, because I'm half Irish, and I've been involved in the efforts to have a national philanthropy policy in Ireland, which got launched a couple of years ago, and now we're into the implementation phase, which is always the harder bit. You can have the words,
Yeah, you can think the idea, but now
you need
implement
the deeds.
it.
So I think actually the countries that are represented here are doing really great work. And as Roger said, we just wanted to help make that happen. If we'd come up, the other two books had a list of recommendations at the end, and said, hey, people should do this, whether it was the media should do this, charities should do that, politicians should do that. And we didn't think that would be helpful in 2025 because there's enough lists and manifestos for what needs to be done, and you can confuse things, and as Roger said, politicians focus on philanthropy is not large, and if within that there seems to be dissent and disagreement about what's needed, then they'll just do nothing. So much better to have a coordinated shared platform. So it's really very exciting that's happening. I can't resist going back to your point about William Hay, because of course he's the new Chancellor of Oxford University, which is where I now work. So everything you said, yes. I agree completely. But I would maybe finesse his point, because of course you do need wealth in order to have rich giving. But for those people who are on the call who are maybe quite new to this, forgive me if you're much more experienced, and this is too basic, but I actually think many people come to these calls because they're quite new and they're trying to find their way in the world of philanthropy and fundraising. So my starter lecture or my starter talk to people in that position is to talk about the ABC of philanthropy. And the A is the ability to give. You can't get money unless people have some spare. And that's entirely subjective. People can have not very much money, but still decide they're going to put some across. So A, subjectively defined ability to give, and of course the wealthier they are, the larger the likelihood that they have the ability to give. But that is not enough to get philanthropy happening. You need the B and the C as well. And the B is the belief in the cause, and the C is a connection. So belief in the cause is there any reason to believe that they care about animals, medical research, education, whatever it might be? You can find that out by doing a fairly basic Google search. Have they talked about having a family member with that illness? Have they attended your institution? Have they given to other similar charities? And donor boards are every fundraiser's friend. Make sure you take photos of donor boards wherever you go, because you'll see their names or not see their names. So B, belief in the cause. Is there any reason to assume that they might be interested in hearing from you? And then C, connection. Can you reach them? Have you got a realistic chance of actually putting your cause in front of this person who has both the ability to give and the belief in the cause? So do you know them? Does someone know them? Could you invite them into an event? Can you reach them somehow? Do they have a foundation, in which case they may be open to applications? So the ABC matters, not just the A.
Yeah, very well put. Thank you. Now I know that we've got only a couple of minutes left as well too, Beth, and I know you have to have a hard finish for your first meeting of the day as well, being over there. But I did want to make some opportunity for some questions, and there's two that have come in as well too. The first one, someone we know all know well, Beth. At this stage, it's Wendy Scaife. Simply saying,
hi Wendy.
So, Wendy, hi Wendy. With Wendy simply saying Australia this year celebrates 50 years of Philanthropy Australia, a recognition of philanthropy as a movement that might work better together. If you had to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 the evolution of philanthropy effectiveness and growth to meet real needs, what would you say and why? And we'll come on to the second question there. And if anyone else has one, please post it, because we've got a couple of minutes left.
Lovely to hear from Wendy. So I spent a summer at Wendy's then institution, the Centre of Philanthropy at the Queensland University of Technology. So I owe a lot in terms of my professional and personal development to Wendy. So thank you so much for being there. I'm going to dodge your question though, Wendy, because I really think that there's great examples of philanthropic effectiveness from centuries ago. I mean, philanthropy's helped to, played a role alongside many others to stop kids being sent up chimneys, to end slavery, to, build hospitals, to build churches and cathedrals. So it has been effective throughout history. It's also been ineffective throughout history when money has maybe been spent on vanity projects or been spent on duplicated projects. So I think I would feel it's such a large area. I would feel unable to give a figure, but I like the question. I do like the question.
Rhodri, any response yourself to that one?
Let's go with 7. I don't know. No, I mean, I would echo that. I think it is difficult. I guess I would just link it back again just on what Beth said to that question of expectations and the framing for the book. Because one of the things I really liked about having arrived at that framing of expectations was it works at lots of different levels, and the kind of, the micro level of the personal and the individual relationships between donors and fundraisers and the organizations they're giving to, or the expectations donors have of themselves or their family have of them. But I think also at a macro level, one of the things that I've long thought is that a lot of the issues that we have in philanthropy and the debates at the end of the day come down to some version of unspoken expectations that people have of philanthropy and the role that it plays and how it can best be done, and those expectations being mismatched. So I think often at the level, for instance, of government, they will have an expectation that philanthropy is, good and effective to the extent that it aligns with the interests of government and sort of furthers those public goods that the government thinks are most important. And annoyingly, philanthropy will do some of that, and there'll be an overlap in the Venn diagram. But then also philanthropists, are very unreasonably going to care about all sorts of other things that the government's not so bothered about, and will give money to those. And I think, in that mismatch of expectations, it's then easy to sort of think, oh, philanthropy is incredibly, badly directed, and there's a kind of really poor mismatch of need and supply. And so I think actually bringing some of those expectations to light can give us a better sense of whether philanthropy is doing a good job, because we've got a more realistic understanding of what it actually is and what function it performs in society, which is not to say that we can't always aim to make it better. And I think, again, to Beth's point, actually a large part of the history of philanthropy has been people trying to do it precisely that in one way or another, getting frustrated with the existing state of philanthropy because it's not well directed enough or kind of not achieving enough in terms of impact, and then trying in various different ways to force it to be better with greater or lesser degrees of success. So I think we're on this kind of constant cyclical journey of trying to do that.
Awesome. There's another question here that's just around hearing more about pathways from fundraiser to advisor. So we'll get close to the end here to get you off the call and get you into your day. Any courses to suggest or reading matter or organizations to look to? They're anonymous in their questions, so I'm not sure if they're Australia, New Zealand or UK. So I'm going to take a quick stab. Maybe you can back it up with some answers. But of course, the University of Kent and Canterbury, where you were, Beth, around things, still is running its MA in Philanthropic Studies. QUT, you can still study where I studied under Wendy as well. We've all been in Wendy's classroom, and the many other lectures that are around the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies. Within QUT, Swinburne University has something. It's remiss of me not to say in my hat, sitting in the Giving Academy, that they have set up a set of courses that are now being promoted, and the pilots have been complete around, both for advisors and fundraisers, and even people that are working within foundations or are leading foundations as well. So there's a lot to find out there as well too, and I'm sure if you follow any of us in that context on LinkedIn. But any more that I'm missing, reading is just like, obviously there's a minefield of reading out there in terms of how you convert from fundraiser to advisor, but any lovely advisors that I know used to be fundraisers as well, which is why we get on so well. Anything that's sitting there for you?
I mean, I can only underline that there is a lot to read there. The Advising Philanthropist book does cover how you get into the profession. It can be through courses, it can be through getting a job in in advisory and working your way up. So we don't get royalties for these books, by the way. Directory of Social Change is a non-profit publisher, which is one of the reasons we publish with them, and they produce a whole range of books that are useful to people working in all different roles in the sector. So I am going to dodge that question as well and say, please take a look at the Advising Philanthropist book. And if anyone has any problem getting books delivered to Australia, you can drop me a line and I will talk to our publisher, because he's very good at helping with that. And just to wish everybody well. This is not an easy sector to be in. It's not an easy sector to try and because it's all voluntary. We've got very few tools and levers at our disposal, other than trying to encourage people to do the right thing and to live a well-lived life. And it's not easy. So I just want to wish good luck to everybody and to thank them for their interest in this latest research. And thanks very much to you as well, David.
Yeah. No worries at all. Thank you so much for joining us. There's probably more questions coming through there. I'm afraid we don't have time for them all, but if I can get answers, I'm sure we'll be able to get them as well too. As these global studies have all shown, the work ahead is not just about, or is not about defending or diminishing philanthropy. It's about shaping something that is both trusted and transformational. That's an absolute wrap for today. Beth, I think I have you 2 minutes late for your first 9 o'clock meeting over there as well too, but the pleasure's been all mine. It's lovely to see you again, Beth. Rhodri, nice to have you on the call. And of course, the campaign to get you over here, which I think Christian's already started with you, and many others around the table in different guises. Could see you here in Brisbane, hopefully not in storm season the way we're experiencing it now, but nonetheless get you over here as well too to join us, as Beth
That'd be
has
great.
in the past as well too. So hopefully see you both again soon. Until next time, everybody, please you'll get a feedback survey from me pretty soon, and a recording as well too that'll come into your inbox as well. But until next time, I guess that silly season where you can say Merry Christmas and have a great New Year. The next episode will be out in the New Year as well. But
happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, happy holidays.
Every dimension of what it is. But thank you both for joining me. Real privilege to hear the research come to life of what we're reading as well too. And until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep finding ways to do good. And much love to you all, and see you all soon. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Rhodri.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
David. Bye, everyone. Bye.